The wanted poster nailed to the post office door in Caldwell, Kansas said Simon Carver was worth $500 dead and $400 alive, which told Esther Bancroft everything she needed to know about the kind of men who had posted it. She had found him face down in the creek bed behind her barn at 4:30 in the morning, on a Tuesday in late October of 1882, when the Kansas sky was so thick with stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across a bolt of black velvet. She had gone out to check on her mare, Dolly, who had been restless all night, kicking at her stall door in a way that usually meant predators, and instead of finding a coyote or a wandering wolf, she had found a man. He was bleeding from a wound along his left side, just below the ribs, and his face was half submerged in the shallow water, and if she had gone back to bed the way her instincts told her to do, he would have drowned in 6 inches of cold water before sunup. She had stood there for a long moment in her wool nightgown with her rifle raised, looking at the dark shape of him, and she had made a decision that would unravel the careful, quiet life she had spent 3 years building out of nothing. She dragged him up the bank herself. She was not a small woman, not soft around the edges, not the kind of widow who sat by the window and waited for things to happen to her. Esther Bancroft was 29 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of women who worked their own land, and strong from 5 years of doing everything alone, first alongside her husband Thomas, and then, after the cholera took him in the spring of 1879, entirely by herself. She had kept the farm. She had kept the cattle. She had kept going. She dragged the man up the bank and got him into the barn because she was not going to bring a stranger bleeding into her house in the middle of the night. She got him into the clean straw of the empty stall next to Dolly's, and she brought the lantern close, and that was when she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair plastered wet against his forehead, and a jaw that needed a shave and long lashes against high cheekbones that made him look almost peaceful despite the blood soaking through his shirt. He was lean but broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that spoke of work and weather, and there was a leather gun belt buckled at his hip, though the holster was empty, the gun apparently lost somewhere in the dark. She worked quickly and without sentiment, cutting away his shirt to get at the wound, which was a bullet grazed deep enough to have cut through muscle but not deep enough to have hit anything vital. She had dealt with worse. She had dug a bullet out of her own thigh 3 years ago when a drunken drifter had fired wild in her yard, and she had done it with a pocket knife and a bottle of whiskey and a determination not to die on her own land. She cleaned the wound and packed it and stitched it closed with the needle and gut thread she kept in the house for exactly these kinds of emergencies, and she tied a bandage tight around his middle, and she covered him with the horse blanket because it was the only spare she had in the barn, and she went back to the house to wait. She did not tell anyone. She was not sure why she made that choice in the moment, only that something about the situation felt like it needed holding close until she understood it better. She was a practical woman, not given to romance or foolishness, but she was also a fair one, and fairness told her that a man passed out in a creek bed was not yet a man she could judge. He woke up that afternoon. She heard Dolly making noise again and went out to the barn with her rifle and found him sitting upright in the straw, blinking in the dim gold light that came through the gaps in the barn slats, pressing one hand carefully against his bandaged side, looking at her with eyes the color of weathered copper, brown and green and something in between, steady and watchful and not afraid. "You fixed me up," he said. His voice was low and rough, like it needed time to warm to the day. "You were bleeding out in my creek," she said, keeping the rifle leveled at him. "I made a practical decision, don't make me regret it." He looked at the rifle without flinching. "That's fair," he said. "I won't." "Who shot you?" A pause. He seemed to be deciding something. "A deputy." "What were you doing to earn it?" Another pause. "Existing in the wrong county." She studied him. He did not look away. There was something in the steadiness of his gaze that she recognized, the look of a person who had learned to hold still under scrutiny because running only made things worse. "What's your name?" she asked. "Simon," he said, and then, after a moment, "Carver." She had not yet seen the poster at that point. She learned it 2 days later when she rode into Caldwell for flour and salt and a spool of wire fencing, and there it was on the post office door, printed rough and black and clear. Simon Carver, wanted for robbery and assault in Comanche County, Kansas and the Indian Territory. $500. The drawing on the poster was not a good likeness, the jaw too square, the brow too heavy, but the name was unmistakable. She stood in front of that poster for a long moment while the October wind moved through the street and lifted the dry leaves against her boots, and she felt the weight of what she had done settle around her shoulders like a yoke. She had taken in the most wanted man in 2 territories and let him sleep in her barn, and she had done it without knowing. And now she knew, and she was standing in front of the post office deciding what to do about it. She bought her flour and her salt and her wire, and she rode home. He was standing at the barn door when she got back, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his chest, and his color better than it had been 2 days ago. He had found a spare shirt, one of Thomas's old ones she kept in the tack room for doing messy work, and it fit him across the shoulders, though it pulled a little there. "You saw it," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," she said. "Then you know what I am." "I know what the poster says you are," she said. "That's not always the same thing." He looked at her steadily. "In this case, it might be closer than you'd hope." She got down from the horse and led it into the barn past him, and he stepped aside to let her, and she unsaddled the mare and hung the tack and brushed the animal down with the curry comb before she spoke again. She needed the time to think. Or maybe she just needed to do something with her hands. "Tell me what you did," she said finally, not looking at him, working the brush along Dolly's flank. Not the poster version, the true one. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he came in and sat on the hay bale near the stall partition, not too close, not crowding her, and he told her. He had grown up in the Panhandle, the 4th of 6 children of a cattle rancher named Harold Carver, who had worked himself to death by 50, and left his wife and children with a stretch of land worth more to the bank than to them. Simon had worked every job there was to work through his 20s, cattle driving, fence posting, freighting, and he had done it honest. The trouble had started 2 years ago when a man named Declan Price, who ran a freight operation out of Dodge City, had offered him work hauling goods from Dodge down into the Indian Territory, and Simon had taken the job because it paid well and he had been sending money home to his mother. He had not known in the beginning that some of the crates were not freight. He had suspected eventually, and when he had opened one in the middle of the night outside a trading post south of Caldwell, he had found rifles, not hunting rifles. Military rifles, army surplus, being smuggled into the territory where they were absolutely forbidden by federal law. He had gone to the county sheriff. The sheriff had been Price's man. The sheriff had arrested Simon on a fabricated charge of assault, and Price had filed a robbery claim saying Simon had stolen the guns, and suddenly Simon Carver was wanted in 2 territories for crimes that belonged to the man who had hired him. He had escaped the county jail before trial. That was the part the poster called robbery, the escape itself, because he had taken a deputy's horse and his own confiscated gun belt to do it. The assault charge was from a fight he had gotten into in the Indian Territory 6 months later, when 2 of Price's men had tried to kill him in a roadhouse to keep him from testifying about what was in those crates. Esther listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, still moving the brush along the horse's side. "Where were you going when you ended up in my creek?" she asked. "I had found a federal marshal out of Wichita who was willing to hear what I had to say about Price's operation. I was riding to meet him in Caldwell. One of Price's men picked up my trail outside of town and I had to run. He winged me. I lost the horse in the dark and ended up in the water." "The marshal," she said. "Is he still in Caldwell? He was supposed to stay until the end of the week." She stopped brushing and turned to look at him fully. He met her eyes. There was no pleading in his expression, no manipulation, just that same steadiness she had noticed from the beginning, a kind of bone-deep patience that she associated with people who had survived things by endurance rather than cleverness. "You can stay in the barn until you're fit to ride," she said. "I have conditions. Name them. You stay out of sight." "I have a farmhand who comes 3 days a week, Tomas Ruiz, who is a good man and who I will not put in a dangerous situation without his knowledge. If you're still here when he comes, I'll tell him, and if he objects, you go. You do not handle any firearm on this property, and you tell me the truth, all of it, whenever I ask." He nodded slowly. "Those are fair conditions." "One more," she said. "If any of this is a lie, if you're not what you say you are, I will ride to Caldwell myself and collect the reward. $500 would pay off a year of my land debt." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to it. "Understood," he said. She went into the house and brought him a plate of food, cold beans and cornbread and a slice of salt pork, and she left it at the barn door without ceremony, and she went to bed, and she lay in the dark for a long time listening to the wind move through the grass and thinking about the peculiar turns a life could take. The week that followed was quieter than she had expected. He was a good patient, which meant he was not a demanding one. He slept when he needed to, kept his wound clean, and was on his feet, walking the barn perimeter slowly by the third day. He was careful not to be visible from the road, as she had asked, and he was useful in small ways when he was able, mending a broken stall latch she had been meaning to fix for 2 months, recoiling the leather harness that had gotten tangled in the tack room, small competent repairs that told her he understood how things worked. Tomas came on Thursday. He was a compact, brown-skinned man of perhaps 55, with gray at his temples and a quiet dignity that Esther had always respected. He had worked this land since her husband's time, and he knew its rhythms as well as she did. She told him straight, standing in the yard with the autumn sun throwing long shadows across the frozen grass, that there was a man in the barn and who that man was. Tomas listened without expression. Then he looked at the barn for a long moment. Then he looked back at Esther. "Declan Price," he said slowly. "You know the name." "I know the operation," Tomas said. "My cousin's boy was killed in the territory 2 years ago near one of Price's trading posts. They said it was an accident." He paused. "It was not an accident." Esther waited. "The man in the barn," Tomas said. "You believe him." "I do," she said. "And I've been wrong before, so take that for what it's worth." Tomas looked at the barn again, then at Esther, and something settled in his face. "Then let's get him to that marshal," he said. It was not as simple as that. The federal marshal, whose name was Walt Gideon, was still in Caldwell, but getting Simon Carver into town unseen was a problem that required some planning. Price's men had eyes in Caldwell. Everyone knew it, and the local sheriff was in Price's pocket. And if Simon were spotted before he could reach Gideon, he would be taken, and the sheriff would make sure he disappeared before the federal man could do anything about it. The problem was still being worked out when something happened that changed everything. On the 4th evening of Simon's stay in the barn, Esther was in the house doing her accounts at the kitchen table when she heard a sound that she recognized after 3 years of living alone on a vulnerable stretch of land. Horses on the road, more than 2, moving at a deliberate pace. She blew out the lamp and went to the window. 4 riders. They pulled up at the gate and sat their horses in the dark, and Esther counted them and then went to the back of the house and slipped out the kitchen door and ran low along the fence line to the barn. She came in through the side door and hissed Simon's name, and he was already awake and standing, which told her his instincts were good. "Riders at the gate," she whispered. 4 of them. He was quiet for half a second. "Price's men. No way to know, but 4 men stopping at a widow's farm after dark is not friendly business." He moved to the barn's small back window, the one that faced the creek bed, and looked out. "They're coming down the track," he said quietly. "I have a rifle and a scatter gun," she said. "You're not shooting anyone on my account," he said, and his voice had gone very calm and very definite. "I'll shoot anyone who comes uninvited onto my property after dark," she said. "That's my business, and it was my business before you got here. Don't make this about you." A short, startled pause. "Fair enough," he said. She got the scattergun from the hook on the barn wall where she kept it for exactly this kind of situation, and she went to the barn door and pushed it open and walked out into the yard with it. The four riders were coming down the lane toward the house, and she planted herself in the middle of the yard with the gun and called out clear and loud, "This is Esther Bancroft's property. State your business or turn around." The riders slowed. The one in front called back, "We're looking for a fugitive, ma'am, Simon Carver. We have reason to believe he's been in this area." "I don't know anyone by that name," she said. "Whoever told you he'd be here was wrong. Now you're welcome to move along." "We'd like to take a look around," the lead rider said, and there was something in his voice, an oiliness, a presumption that made her grip on the scattergun tight. "No," she said, "you would not. You have no badge, no warrant, and no right to search my property. If you have legal authority, ride to Caldwell and get a writ and come back with a proper lawman. Otherwise, you get off my land." There was a consultation among the riders, low voices she could not hear. Then the lead one said, with a different tone entirely, "Ma'am, Mr. Price doesn't have to do this the polite way." "Mr. Price," she said, keeping her voice steady, "is not standing in my yard. You are, and I have 2 barrels and I'm a very good shot. So unless you'd like to find out, I suggest you make a different decision." Another pause. Then, slow and unhappy, the 4 riders turned and went back up the lane and out through the gate, and she stood in the yard until the sound of hooves was gone. She went back into the barn. Simon was in the shadows just inside the door, and she could see in the darkness that he had found something to arm himself with, a heavy farrier's hammer from the tool rack, which was not much but was something. "They'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why we can't wait anymore. We need to get you to Marshal Gideon tomorrow." She went to the house and wrote a note, and at 5 in the morning, before the sun was up, she sent Tomas Ruiz into Caldwell with it, addressed to Walt Gideon, Federal Marshal, care of the Caldwell Hotel. The note said simply that she had information relevant to the Price smuggling operation and asked the marshal to meet her the following evening at her farm, alone. Then she waited, and she and Simon spent the whole day in the strange, suspended quiet of people who know something is coming and cannot yet see its shape. He helped her with the farm work. She let him because he needed something to do and because she did, too. They worked side by side through the cold October morning, mending the fence section along the west pasture where the wire had gone soft, and she handed him the pliers and he worked the wire with the sure, efficient movements of someone who had done it 100 times, and they did not talk much, but the silence between them had a different quality than loneliness. In the afternoon she brought out 2 cups of coffee and they sat on the fence rail facing west, where the Kansas sky was doing something extraordinary, going purple and orange and rose all at once as the sun settled toward the flat horizon, and she found herself looking at his profile in the fading light, the strong line of jaw, the patient set of his mouth, and she felt something she had not felt in 3 years, a kind of pull toward another person, a gravity, and she did not entirely trust it. But she did not entirely dismiss it either. "Tell me about before all of this," she said. "Before Price. What were you doing that you loved?" He thought about it. "I spent a summer working a cattle drive up from Texas," he said. 1878. 3 months on the trail, slept under the open sky most of it. There's a particular sound the cattle make at night when they've settled, a kind of low, steady breathing like the herd is one big animal, and the stars out there on the flat country are something you can't believe until you've seen them." He paused. "I loved that. The size of it. The clean simplicity of one job that took everything you had." "Why did you stop?" "Mother needed the money more than the cattle business could pay it," he said. "Freighting paid better, at least until Price." "I'm sorry," she said. He turned to look at her. "What about you? What did you love before Thomas died?" She was quiet for a moment, surprised that he had turned it back so directly. "Teaching," she said. I taught school in Illinois before Thomas and I came west. 8 grades in one room, all ages, and I loved it fiercely. The way a child's face changes when something becomes clear to them, when they go from struggling to suddenly having it. There's nothing quite like watching that. Why didn't you go back to it after? She looked out at the horizon. Because I had built something here. Because leaving would have meant Thomas's work and mine together meant nothing. Because this is mine now, for better or worse. She paused. And because some days I think I stayed out of pure stubbornness. He laughed at that, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, unguarded and genuine, and she felt the pull again, stronger this time. Tomas came back in the early evening with a reply from Marshal Gideon. The federal man would come the following evening at 7. He asked only that she be certain of her information, and that she have the witness ready to present. She read the note twice and folded it carefully. "He's coming," she told Simon. Simon stood very still for a moment, and she saw something move across his face, not fear exactly, but the kind of tension that comes from wanting something very much and knowing it might still go wrong. "What happens to you," she said carefully, "if Gideon doesn't believe you?" "I run," he said simply. "I keep running, there's no other option. And if he does believe you," he was quiet. "I haven't let myself think that far," he said. "It felt like bad luck." She understood that. She had learned not to count things until they were in hand. "Well," she said, "let's see." That night he slept in the barn and she lay in the house in the dark and thought about 5 years ago, when she and Thomas had driven a wagon west from Illinois with everything they owned, and the absolute certainty that they were going to build something good. Thomas had been 32 when he died, which seemed impossibly young now that she was 29, and she had spent 3 years in the grief and then in the practical business of surviving it, and she had not thought much about the future, only about the present, only about keeping the farm going. But lying there in the dark, she thought about it now, and she thought about the man in her barn, and she told herself firmly that she was being foolish. She barely knew him. The situation they were in was a manufactured intimacy, proximity and shared danger and nothing more. She should not read into the way he had listened to her talk about teaching, or the way his hands moved on the fence wire, or the sound of his laugh in the October air. She fell asleep telling herself these sensible things, and she dreamed about the cattle drive he had described, all that flat open country and the breathing of 10,000 animals settling into rest. Marshal Walt Gideon was a tall, thin man of about 50, with a drooping gray mustache and sharp, pale eyes that did not miss much. He came alone as requested, on a good bay horse, and he sat in Esther's kitchen with his hat on the table and a cup of coffee in his hand, and he listened to Simon Carver talk for nearly 2 hours without interruption. Esther sat at the end of the table and watched them both. She watched Gideon's eyes while Simon talked, looking for the telltale signs of skepticism or disbelief, and she did not find them. What she found instead was the focused, concentrated attention of a man building a case in his head. Simon laid out everything: the freight routes, the type of rifles, the trading post locations, the men he could name, the dates he could remember. He described the jail, the escape, the names of the sheriff and 2 of his deputies who had been present when the fabricated charges were filed. He was precise and detailed in a way that could not be easily invented. When Simon finished, Gideon set down his coffee cup and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Declan Price," he said, "has been on the federal government's watch list for 3 years. We've known about the gun running in general terms. We have not been able to get anyone close enough to give us the specifics." He looked at Simon. "You can testify to all of this in a federal court." "Yes," Simon said, "the sheriff in Comanche County name." "Ed Tolliver." Gideon's eyes sharpened. "I know that name," he said. He looked at Esther. "You've been harboring this man." "Harboring," she said levelly, "implies I knew what I was doing. I pulled him out of my creek and let him heal up in my barn. But yes, for the past week I have chosen not to turn him over because what I heard from him seemed worth checking. It could make you an accessory." "I appreciate the legal education," she said. "What are you going to do about Price?" Another moment of looking at her. Something in Gideon's expression shifted just slightly into something that might have been respect. "What I'm going to do," he said, "is go back to Wichita and send wires to the federal court and bring enough marshals to Comanche County to take Price and Tolliver into custody simultaneously so neither one can warn the other." He paused. "What I need from you, Mr. Carver, is for you to stay alive and accessible until I can get that arranged. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Simon looked at him. "And the charges against me?" "Charges filed by a corrupt sheriff on behalf of a man being federally investigated for gun running," Gideon said. "Those charges will be reviewed and, in my professional opinion, dismissed. But I need you alive to testify. So wherever you've been staying, stay there and stay quiet." He rode out just before 9, and Esther closed the door behind him and turned to look at Simon, who was standing in the middle of her kitchen with his hands loose at his sides and an expression she had not seen on him before. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just been told the ground under his feet might actually be solid. 3 weeks, she said. "I know," he said. "That's too long. I should find somewhere else, somewhere I'm not putting you at risk." "You're welcome to try to find somewhere better," she said. "But Price's men were here 2 nights ago and they'll be watching the roads and you're not fully healed yet." She paused. "You can stay." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, quiet and direct. "Because," she said, "I believe you, and I have some stubbornness on this matter now." The 3 weeks that followed were, if she were honest with herself in later years, the most vivid of her entire life. The fear was real and present, a low constant hum beneath everything, but so was something else, something that grew slowly and naturally in the way that things grow when they are real, not sudden and dramatic but gradual and deep, like a root going down. They talked. In the evenings, after the work was done and the November dark came early across the flat Kansas land, she would bring supper to the barn, and more often than not they ended up talking past the time she should have gone to the house, talking in the lantern light with the horses breathing quietly nearby and the wind working at the seams of the old barn. He told her about his brothers and sisters, about his mother who still lived on a piece of the old ranch that the bank had not taken, a stubborn old woman who kept chickens and grew her own tobacco and refused to be pitied. He told her about a book he had read 3 times, a battered copy of David Copperfield that he had carried in his saddlebag for 2 years until it fell apart, and he talked about it with such specific, alive detail that she understood he was a man who thought carefully about things. She told him about Illinois, about the schoolroom, about the particular satisfaction of teaching a child to read, watching the symbols resolve into meaning. She told him about Thomas, not the grief of his loss but who he had been, a good man, quiet and funny in unexpected ways, a man who had loved open country and had a gift for making things grow. She did not cry when she talked about Thomas now, which was how she knew that enough time had passed. She watched Simon with the farm and with Tomas, and she learned things about him that way, things you could not get from conversation. He was patient with Tomas, respectful in a quiet, genuine way, asking questions about the land and the cattle with real interest. He was careful with the animals, efficient but not rough. He worked hard and without complaint. These were not performances. She could always tell performances. They were just who he was. One morning she found him in the barn with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, doing what she could see was arithmetic, careful columns of figures, and she stopped in the doorway. "What are you working out?" she asked. He looked up, unself-conscious about it. "What I'd need to start something of my own," he said. "If this all goes the way Gideon says it will. I've been drifting for 2 years. I'd like to stop." "What would you do if you could choose?" He looked at the figures. "A small horse operation, breeding, some training. I have a feel for horses." He paused. "I know it's a long way from where I am now. I know a thing or two about starting something from not much," she said. He looked at her with that steady copper-colored gaze. "I know you do," he said. In the second week, something happened that neither of them planned or orchestrated. She had been carrying a heavy bucket of water from the pump to the horse trough, and the ground was icy from a hard overnight freeze, and she slipped. She did not fall, she caught herself, but the bucket went over and she made a startled sound, and Simon was across the barn and had hold of her arm before she had fully processed what had happened. He steadied her, his hand around her upper arm, and she caught her balance, and then they were standing close together in the cold barn air, and neither of them moved away. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The lantern behind him made a warm gold halo against the cold dark, and his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, the careful guard down for just a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said, and then very quietly, as if he were testing the words, "Esther." It was the first time he had used her name, just her name, no preamble. She felt it go all the way through her. She stepped back and picked up the empty bucket and went to the pump to refill it, and she did not look at him again for several minutes, and when she did, he was back at what he had been doing, but there was something changed in the air between them, something acknowledged without being said. That evening she brought supper and stayed longer than usual. The wind was high outside, pressing against the barn walls, making the lantern flame flutter, and it was cold enough that their breath showed in the air, and she had brought an extra blanket for him without being asked, and when she handed it to him, their fingers touched on the wool and neither of them pulled away immediately. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said, because the night felt like the kind of night that warranted honesty. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "When I was 17, he said slowly, "my father took me out to the east pasture and told me that the land was going to go, that the bank had the notes and he couldn't hold them and I should make my plans accordingly and not count on the ranch. And I told him I understood, and I went back to the house and I sat in the barn and I cried for about an hour, not for the land, for him. Because he looked like something had gone out in him, like a lamp being turned down, and I didn't know what to do with that. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind. My father was a very dignified man," Simon continued, "and he had worked for that land since before I was born, and watching him tell me it was over was the loneliest I have ever felt, including on the run, including in jail." "I'm sorry," she said, and it was not a formal condolence but something real, something that went toward the specific grief he had named. He shook his head slightly. "He died 2 years later, still working. He did not stop. I respected that." He paused. "What's yours?" She looked at her hands. "After Thomas died," she said, "I found a letter in his coat pocket, a letter he had written but never sent to his sister in Ohio. He had written about me in it." She paused. "About how proud he was of me, how he thought I was the strongest person he had ever known. He had written it 3 weeks before he died, and he had never said those things to my face, and I would have given almost anything to have heard them while he was alive." She was quiet. "I keep the letter. I've read it many times. But there is a particular ache in knowing that some things go unsaid until it's too late." Simon looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You should know," he said very quietly, "that I think the same thing about you, the strongest person I've encountered in a long time, and I'm saying it to your face because apparently that matters." She felt the warmth of it spread through her chest, unexpected and complete. She was not a woman who blushed, but she looked down at her hands and felt something there, something soft and startled and real. "That matters," she said. "Yes." In the 3rd week, trouble came back. Tomas rode in fast from Caldwell on a Wednesday morning with the news that 2 of Price's men had been asking at the general store and the saloon about the Bancroft farm specifically, and whether the widow out on the West Road had been seen with any strangers recently. The storekeeper, who liked Esther and had no love for rough men asking personal questions, had said nothing, but the saloon keeper was a different matter. "They know you're here," Tomas said, looking at Simon. "Or they strongly suspect it." Esther was already thinking, how far out is Gideon's operation? "He sent a wire through Tomas," Simon said, "for more days. He's moving on Price this coming Sunday." "4 days," she said. "That's the problem." They worked it out together, the 3 of them, standing in the barn in the cold November morning. The plan they landed on was simple. Tomas would ride to Caldwell and send a wire to Gideon explaining the situation. Esther would make the farm look as normal as possible, going about her routine, visible to anyone watching, doing nothing that suggested she had anything to hide. Simon would stay completely out of sight, not in the barn but in the root cellar beneath the house, which was accessible through a trap door in the kitchen floor, and which no one would search without pulling up the floorboards. It was dark in the root cellar and cold and smelled of earth and stored potatoes, and Simon lowered himself into it without complaint, and she handed down a blanket and a lantern and a plate of food, and she closed the trap door and put the kitchen table back over it and went on with her day. It was one of the hardest days she could remember. She cooked and swept and went to the yard to tend the chickens and to the barn to feed the horses, and she did all of it with the deliberate, visible normalcy of a woman who had nothing to worry about, while inside she felt something tight and raw and protective that she did not examine too closely. Two of Price's men rode up around 2 in the afternoon. She saw them from the kitchen window and had the door open and was standing in the frame before they reached the porch steps, arms crossed, expression neutral. "Mrs. Bancroft," the lead one said. He was a heavy-set man with a red face and small eyes. "We're sorry to disturb you again." "You're not sorry," she said pleasantly. "What do you want?" "Just checking in, making sure you hadn't had any unwanted visitors." He smiled in a way that was not a smile. "I have 2 right now," she said, a short silence. Then, "We heard you might have been sheltering a fugitive." "You heard wrong," she said. "I am alone on this farm. I have been alone on this farm, and I would ask you to leave before I determine that you are the trespassers." They looked at each other. They looked at the barn, at the yard, at the house. They could not search without cause, not openly, not here, because Price's operation depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate business, and open assault on a widow's property would draw the kind of attention that was bad for smuggling. They left. She waited until they were out of sight, and then she went to the kitchen and moved the table and opened the trap door and said down into the dark, "They're gone." His voice came up steady. "I heard. You were very convincing." She sat on the floor with her legs dangling into the trap door, and she pressed her back against the cabinet and let out a slow, controlled breath, and she heard him moving below, the scrape of the lantern, and then his face appeared in the opening, looking up at her, and they were very close, barely a foot apart, and she thought with sudden, startling clarity that she did not want him to leave. Not in 4 days. Not after Gideon moved on Price. Not at all. And she was terrified of that thought and certain of it simultaneously. "Esther," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything." "I know what you haven't said," she told him, which was, she supposed, an admission all by itself. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When this is over, when it's safe, I'd like to talk about that." "So would I," she said. Sunday came with a hard frost and a sky the color of iron, and at 3 in the afternoon a rider came fast up the road, and it was Tomas, and his face when he came through the gate was doing something extraordinary. He was smiling. "Gideon moved at dawn," he said. "Took Price at his office in Dodge. Took Tolliver at the Comanche County Jail. 40 federal marshals, 3 simultaneous operations. It's done." Simon was standing at the barn door and Esther was in the yard, and she watched his face receive this news, watched the long-held tension go out of him all at once, like a cord cut, and he stood there in the iron-colored November light and pressed one hand over his eyes for a moment. She crossed the yard to him. She did not plan it. She was just moving toward him the way things move toward what they need. She stopped in front of him and looked up at his face when he lowered his hand, and his eyes were very bright. "It's over," she said. "Almost," he said. "I still have to testify. But you can do that as Simon Carver, free man, not fugitive." "Yes," he said, and then very quietly, "Yes." She put her hand on his arm, just her hand resting there, and he covered it with his, and they stood like that in the cold yard while Tomas diplomatically went to put his horse away. He went to Wichita 2 days later to give his formal testimony before a federal judge, and she watched him ride out from the gate with Tomas alongside him, and she felt the absence of him like a change in the weather, something in the atmosphere that was different and wrong. He was gone for 11 days. She kept the farm going. She did not write to him because she did not have an address and because she was not certain of enough yet to put it on paper. She worked and waited and tried not to count the days. He came back on a Thursday, shortly after noon, and she was in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horse on the road and looked up. He looked different and the same. He had shaved properly and was wearing a shirt that was his own and a coat she had not seen, and he sat the horse well and easy, and when he came through the gate and got down, she was standing with the axe in her hand, and they looked at each other across the frozen yard. "Price is in federal custody," he said. "Tolliver too. The charges against me have been formally withdrawn. I am, as of last Tuesday, a free man in both territories." She set the axe against the wood pile. "Congratulations," she said. He walked toward her slowly and she did not move back. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her with that steady copper-colored gaze. "I thought about what I wanted to do," he said. "When I was in Wichita, I thought about the horse operation, the starting over." "Good," she said. "I thought about where," he said, "which is a different question." She waited. "This is good land," he said carefully. "West of Caldwell, good grass, good water, your creek runs year-round." "It does," she said. "And you said you wanted to expand the stock." "I have been considering it," she said. He looked at her, and the careful, measured tone gave way to something simpler and more direct. "I'm trying to tell you something without saying it badly," he said, "which is that in the last month I have felt more at home on your farm and in your company than I have felt anywhere in several years, and I am not sure what to do with that except to be honest about it." "Simon," she said. "Yes. I have a condition." He blinked. "Another one. The last one was sensible and this one is too," she said, and she felt something bright and terrified opening in her chest. "If you're talking about staying, and I think you are, then I need you to say it plainly, because I have had enough of unsaid things to last me a lifetime." He was very still for a moment. Then, "I would like to stay. I would like to build something here with you, if you'll have me. I am not a wealthy man, and I have recently been the most wanted man in 2 territories, and I have very little to offer except my work and my honesty, and the fact that I find you, Esther Bancroft, to be the most remarkable person I have ever met." The cold air was very sharp and clear, and somewhere a hawk was calling, and the sky had gone from iron to something softer, almost white, and she took one step toward him and reached up and put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and felt it beating under her palm. "That," she said, "is a very good offer." He put his hands on her face, large and warm and careful, and he looked at her for a long moment as if committing her to memory, and then he kissed her. It was not tentative, but it was not rushed either. It was the kiss of a man who intended to mean it, and she kissed him back with the same intention, with 3 years of solitude and all the stubbornness she'd spoken of and something new, something that felt remarkably like hope. Tomas Ruiz, who appeared from around the corner of the barn at exactly the wrong moment, turned immediately around and went back where he had come from, and neither of them noticed. They did not rush anything. That was important to both of them. Esther was not a woman who made impulsive decisions with her heart or her land, and Simon had spent 2 years in chaos and wanted, very much, to do things properly and in good order. He boarded with Tomas in Caldwell for 2 months while he and Esther figured out what they were building together, and he came to the farm 4 days a week, and they worked side by side and they talked constantly about everything: the farm's finances, the future of the cattle market, what they each believed about God and luck and the nature of honesty, what they wanted from the years ahead. He met her conditions, all of them, the practical ones about the farm structure and the one she had not articulated until the 3rd week of December, standing in her kitchen with snow falling outside the window, which was that she needed to know he was choosing this freely, not because she had been a convenient harbor, not because the situation had manufactured something that wasn't real. He looked at her with great seriousness and said, "The situation was what introduced us. It is not what I feel." Those are two different things. He paused. When I was in Wichita, I had 11 days in which I was free and safe and could have gone anywhere. I came back here. Not because I had nowhere else to go, because this is where I wanted to be. She believed him. She had always been good at knowing when she was being lied to, and she was not being lied to. He proposed to her on a Saturday afternoon in January of 1883, formally and carefully, standing in the barn of all places, which was appropriate, she thought, since that was where it had all begun. He had a ring he had bought in Caldwell, a simple silver band, not much, but chosen with care, and he went down on one knee in the clean straw and said what he felt and asked her plainly. She said yes without hesitation, which was the most decisive she had felt about anything in years. They were married in March, when the Kansas spring was just beginning to soften the ground, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with Tomas Ruiz and his wife Maria standing up with them, and the minister who had known Esther since she had moved to the territory, and who seemed genuinely pleased about the whole affair. There were perhaps 30 people there, neighbors and townspeople who had watched Esther Bancroft keep her farm alone for 3 years, and who apparently approved of the man she had chosen. The reception was held in the yard of the farm, with Tomas's wife and 2 neighbor women cooking enough food for twice the company, and someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar. And in the late afternoon light of a March day in 1883, Esther Bancroft became Esther Carver, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that the future was a door open wide rather than a thing to be endured. She and Simon danced in the yard of the farm that had been hers alone and was now theirs together, and he danced well, which surprised her, though it shouldn't have, and he held her close and moved them through the music with the same patient, sure quality that marked everything he did. "Are you happy?" he said against her hair. "Enormously," she said. "You?" "I cannot account for the change in my fortunes," he said, "except to say that I think it started with a woman who found me face down in her creek and decided not to leave me there." "I considered leaving you," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "I'm glad you decided against it." They built the horse operation slowly and carefully, starting with 3 mares they purchased that first spring from a reputable breeder in Wichita, animals with good bloodlines and sound conformation, and they built a new paddock and a training ring, and Simon worked with the animals with a gift that she had known he had from watching him with Dolly that first week. He had a way with horses that was not about dominance but about attention, about reading the animal and meeting it on its own terms, and word spread, the way it does in cattle country, and by that first summer they had requests from 2 neighboring ranchers to train their young horses, and by the fall they had turned a small profit on top of covering their costs. The farm debt that had been weighing on Esther since Thomas's death was paid off by the end of 1883, which she marked by sitting at the kitchen table with the final receipt in her hand, and allowing herself exactly 5 minutes of silent gratitude before getting up and starting supper. Tomas continued working with them, though on different terms now, something closer to partnership than employment, and Simon treated him accordingly, which was the right thing to do and which Esther had been doing for 2 years already. The older man's knowledge of the land and the local cattle market was worth more than what any wage could capture. They had disagreements, she and Simon, because they were both strong-minded and neither of them was inclined to back down from a position without good reason, and their arguments were sometimes loud and always direct and always resolved, because both of them had learned, in different ways, the cost of things left unresolved. She would take her stubbornness into the barn and he would take his silence to the fence line, and within an hour or 2 they would come back to the same kitchen and work it out. He was generous with her in ways that mattered to her, not with money, because they were building that slowly, but with space and respect. He never told her what to do with her farm, their farm, without discussion first. He asked her opinion on everything and meant it. He argued with her sometimes hard, but he listened, actually listened, in the way that many men she had known did not. She loved him in the way she had come to understand love over the course of her life, not as a feeling that arrived whole and stayed static, but as something you built every day out of small choices, out of honesty, and showing up and choosing to try even when it was hard. She had loved Thomas that way. She loved Simon Carver that way too, and it was different. It was its own thing, shaped by who they each were and what they had survived, and she did not compare it to what had come before because comparison was not the point. The point was that she chose him and he chose her, every morning, and that felt like enough. In the fall of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child. He was in the middle of mending a bridle when she said it, sitting at the kitchen table with the leather in his hands, and he set it down very carefully and looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as stricken with joy, the look of a man receiving something he had not let himself want. He got up and crossed to her and put his arms around her and held on, and she felt his breath in her hair, unsteady. "A baby," he said, like he was testing the reality of the word. "So the doctor in Caldwell indicates," she said. He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you well? Are you?" "I am fine," she said. "I am perfectly fine. I am 31 years old and strong as a fence post, and we are going to be absolutely fine." He pressed his forehead against hers. "A baby," he said again. "You mentioned that," she said. Their son was born in the spring of 1885, on a morning when the Kansas land was doing its absolute best, green and soft and loud with birds, and Esther labored with the same focused stubbornness she brought to everything difficult. And when it was done and the midwife placed the baby in her arms, she looked at his scrunched-up red face and his dark hair, and she thought with a kind of surprised completeness that this was what the future had been waiting to show her. Simon was there, which was not the common practice but which she had insisted on, and he sat by the bed and held her hand through the hard parts, and when the baby came he cried, which she had not expected, though she understood it perfectly. They named him Thomas Harold Carver, Thomas for her first husband who had built this land and Harold for Simon's father who had loved his own land with everything he had, and it felt right to give the boy both names, to let him carry both histories forward. Thomas Harold was a large, noisy, good-natured infant who grew into a large, noisy, good-natured boy, with his father's steady copper-colored eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. And from the time he could walk he wanted to be wherever the horses were, which pleased Simon enormously. The horse operation had grown considerably by the time Thomas Harold was 2. They had expanded the breeding program to 12 mares, had hired a young man named Caleb Morse to help with the training, and had developed enough of a reputation in the Kansas territory that buyers came from as far as Colorado to look at their stock. Esther kept the books, a skill she had taught herself out of necessity, and at which she proved to be very good, and she managed their finances with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything. She had also started something she had not planned. In the winter of 1885, when the weather kept neighbors indoors and restless, she had started holding reading evenings at the farm, 2 nights a week, for the children of neighboring families who had no access to a school and whose parents were pleased to have someone willing to teach. It had grown from 3 children to 12 within 2 months, and by the spring of 1886 there was enough community interest and enough pressure on the county that a proper school had been established in a building in Caldwell, and Esther was asked to be its first teacher. She rode to Caldwell and back 3 days a week, and Simon managed the farm on those days, and it worked because they had built something together that had room for both of them to be fully themselves in it, which was, she had come to think, the most important thing a marriage could do. There was an afternoon in the fall of 1886 when Thomas Harold was just past his first birthday and old enough to sit up and watch the horses from the fence rail, when she came home from Caldwell to find Simon in the paddock working with a young sorrel colt, patient and focused, moving the animal through its paces, and Thomas Harold was sitting on the fence with Tomas's steady hand behind him, watching his father with absolute attention. She pulled up her horse and sat watching all three of them for a long moment, the golden afternoon light making everything amber and particular, the boy on the fence, and the man in the ring, and the old man who had helped her hold all of this together from the beginning, and the horses moving in their eloquent animal way, and the flat Kansas sky overhead, enormous and luminous. She felt something she did not quite have a word for, a fullness, a sense of being entirely, completely in the right place at the right time in her own life, and she understood that she had earned it, not because life was fair, it frequently was not, but because she had kept going through the unfair parts with enough stubbornness to get to this. Simon looked up and saw her at the gate. His face changed when he saw her, the way it always did, that small, private change that was for her specifically, and he raised one hand, just a wave, just hello, and she raised one back. She got down from her horse and went through the gate, and he came to meet her, leaving the colt in Tomas's hands. "Good day in town?" he asked. "Very good," two of the boys today read out loud in front of the class without hesitation. "One of them has been afraid to try for 3 months. She smiled thinking of it. The sorrel is ready to sell," he said. "He's better than we thought when we started him." "Good news on both counts," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that steady, open expression that she had come to read very well. "Are you happy?" He asked, same question he had asked her at their wedding. A question she had come to understand. He asked not from insecurity, but from genuine, continuing interest in the answer. "Enormously," she said, same answer as before. And it was as true now as it had been then, truer maybe, deepened by time and difficulty and everything they had built together. He kissed her there in the paddock in the afternoon light, easy and unhurried, with their son watching from the fence rail and calling out something that might have been a word or might have been a happy noise, and the horses moving, and the October sky doing that extraordinary thing it did over the flat Kansas country. And she held on to him for a moment longer than the kiss strictly required, feeling the solid reality of him. This man she had pulled out of a creek bed in the middle of the night and let sleep in her barn because something in her had decided he was worth the risk. She had been right. That was what she thought, standing in the paddock with her husband's arms around her and her son's voice in the bright air. She had been right. In the years that followed, the Carver farm continued to grow in the patient, solid way that real things grow. By 1888, they had added a second barn and expanded the pasture acreage by purchasing 40 acres from a neighboring homesteader who was moving back east, and the horse operation had become one of the better-known breeding programs in that part of the Kansas territory. Esther continued teaching in Caldwell, and by 1888 the school had grown to the point where a second teacher was needed, a young woman named Clara Whitfield from Ohio, who had come west with the same intentions Esther had once had about building something in new country, and Esther welcomed her with the same practical directness she brought to everything. Tomas Ruiz, who had been with the farm longer than almost any chapter of its history, finally slowed down in 1888 when his back made the heavier work impossible, and Simon and Esther sat down with him and worked out a new arrangement in which he consulted and advised and was paid for it, and his dignity was intact and his knowledge was still available, which was the important thing. He and his wife Maria came to supper at the farm every Sunday, and this became a fixture so fundamental to the weak structure that it felt wrong without it. A second child came in the winter of 1888. She was born in December, when the Kansas wind was making its opinions known about everything, and she came into the world with a decisive cry that announced her as someone who planned to be heard, and they named her June Ann Carver, June for the month they had planned to name her had she arrived in summer, and Ann for Esther's mother. Thomas Harold, who was 3, greeted his sister with the suspicious skepticism of a firstborn confronted with competition, but within 2 weeks he had assigned himself her protector, which was an improvement. June Ann had her mother's dark eyes and her father's patience, which was an unusual combination that produced a very composed small person who watched the world with a considering expression and then acted on her conclusions without hesitation. Esther recognized herself in the girl, and it delighted her. Simon, with 2 children, was something to observe. He was the same with them as he was with the horses and the land and with her, patient and consistent and fully present, and he was funny in the quiet, unexpected way that she had always loved about him, finding the surprising angle on things, the detail that reframed the whole picture. He read to them in the evenings, both of them, from the books on the shelf that had grown considerably since the days when the house had held only Thomas's Bible and Esther's 3 worn novels. He read them David Copperfield, which was appropriate, and he read them stories about the West that made Thomas Harold sit up straight with his eyes enormous. And June Ann usually fell asleep against his arm before the 3rd page of anything. There was an evening in the spring of 1889 when Esther was grading her students' work at the kitchen table, and Simon was reading to the children in the front room, and she could hear his voice moving through the walls, low and steady, reading about something with enough adventure in it to keep Thomas Harold from squirming, and June Ann's occasional murmur, and the sound of the spring wind in the new grass outside, and the faint smell of the supper she had made still in the air, and the lamp warm on her papers. And she set her pen down and simply listened to her life for a moment. She thought about the woman she had been in the fall of 1882, a widow of 3 years with a land debt and a careful, defended solitude and a determination to need no one. She thought about what it had taken to change that, not some dramatic act of will, but a man in a creek bed and the choice not to walk away, the choice to pull him up the bank and see what he was made of. She had never been sorry. Through all of it, the fear and the uncertainty and the hard first year of marriage when they were both learning how to share space and share decisions, she had never once been sorry that she had made that choice. That said something, she thought. That said something about the nature of the right kind of risk. She picked up her pen and went back to her papers. Declan Price's federal trial had concluded in 1883, and he had been sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for the illegal transport of military-grade weapons into protected territories and for the bribery of a county sheriff. Ed Tolliver, the Comanche County sheriff, had received 4 years. Several of Price's other associates had received varying sentences. The whole thing had been reported in the Caldwell newspaper and the Wichita papers, and Simon's name had appeared in the coverage as the witness whose testimony had been central to the prosecution, and the editor of the Caldwell paper had run a small editorial about the courage required to do what Simon had done. Esther had clipped the editorial and kept it folded in the box where she kept Thomas's letter, which said something about what she valued and who she was. The poster that had once hung on the Caldwell post office door, the one that named Simon Carver as wanted in 2 territories and offered $500 for information leading to his capture, had been taken down in the fall of 1882 when Gideon filed his interim report. She had never told Simon this, but Tomas had retrieved the poster when it came down and brought it to her, and she had considered burning it and then thought better of it and had folded it away in the same box, behind Thomas's letter. She kept it not as a trophy or a joke, but as a piece of the story, the specific, improbable, particular story of how her life had turned out the way it did. Someday, she thought, she would tell her children. Someday she would sit Thomas Harold and June Ann down and tell them about the October night in 1882 when she had gone to check on a restless mare and found something else entirely, and she would let them make of it what they would. She suspected Thomas Harold would find it thrilling. She suspected June Ann would find it logical. In the fall of 1889, the Kansas Territory, along with several others, began the formal process that would lead to statehood, which was a political development that Esther followed with genuine interest because she had strong opinions about land rights and school funding, and a number of other things that statehood would affect. She attended several meetings in Caldwell at which these things were discussed, and she was not quiet at them, and Simon attended with her and was quiet mostly, which was a good division of labor. Tomas, at one of these meetings, pointed out to anyone who would listen that the land rights discussions rarely included the rights of Mexican-American families, who had been working Kansas land for decades before the current legal structures had taken shape, and that this was an injustice worth naming. Simon stood up in that meeting and said that Tomas was right, that he had worked alongside Tomas for 7 years and the man's claim to fair treatment was not a question, and Esther watched her husband say it directly and clearly and felt the specific pride of knowing him. It was not enough, what was said in one meeting in a small prairie town. They both knew that. But saying it was not nothing, either. Kansas became a state in 1861, which predated the Carvers, but the formal reorganization of its land and legal structures was ongoing through this period, and navigating it required attention and advocacy, and Esther was good at both. The winter of 1889 was hard, one of the harder ones in recent memory, with a blizzard in February that kept them housebound for 4 days, and tested the heat retention of the house considerably, and provided Thomas Harold with the most exciting 4 days of his young life, since the drifts on the north side were high enough to build through, and the boy constructed fortifications of impressive engineering for a 4-year-old. Simon spent those 4 days reading and doing carpentry repairs inside the house, and playing long games of cards with Thomas Harold at a level that gave the boy a genuine chance, and teaching June Ann to say horse in a way that was clear enough to be understood. Esther spent them grading papers she had brought home and baking and watching her family from whatever corner of the house she happened to be in, thinking that confinement, with the right people, was not confinement at all. By the time the storm broke and the world outside was white and still and blazing with winter light, she felt certain of things that she had not been certain of before, which was that this was exactly the life she had intended, that the work and the difficulty of it were not obstacles to happiness but part of its texture, and that she would not trade a day of it. Spring came, as it always did, in a rush of mud and new grass and the smell of things opening up, and the horses dropped their winter coats, and the work of the farm returned in its full, demanding, satisfying weight, and Esther rode to school, and Simon worked the paddock and the children grew, and Tomas and Maria came on Sundays, and the Carver farm held its place on the west road outside Caldwell as a thing that had been built with intention and had held. There was a morning in April of 1890 when Esther woke before the rest of the house and dressed quietly in the dark and went out to the barn, which was a thing she still did sometimes, as she had always done, from the years of widowhood and before, this particular early morning solitude being something she needed and had never given up. She stood in the barn door in the pre-dawn dark with her cup of coffee and looked out at the property, at the 2 barns and the paddocks, and the house with its lamps still dark, and the east horizon beginning to define itself in shades of gray and rose. And she felt the particular piece of a life that has been chosen and built and is continuing to be built. Dolly was in the end stall, 22 years old now and retired from everything but the pure dignity of existing, and Esther went to her and stood with one hand on the mare's neck, the way she had stood on the morning in October of 1882 when she had gone to check on the horse's restlessness and found Simon Carver face down in her creek. She had not known, that morning, what she was beginning. She could not have known. She had only known what was in front of her, a man who needed help, and she had helped him, and everything that followed had followed from that. The horse leaned into her hand with the comfortable trust of a long familiar presence, and the barn smelled of hay and leather, and the particular warmth of large animals at rest, and outside the birds were beginning, one then several then many, the way the morning always built itself from quiet to full. She heard the house door and footsteps in the yard, and she knew them without looking, the particular cadence she had learned in 8 years of sharing a life. And she turned when he came into the barn. Simon in his work clothes with his coffee, and the slightly unguarded look he always had in the first minutes of the morning before the day fully organized itself. He came to stand beside her at Dolly's stall. He did not say anything for a moment, looking at the mare, looking at the gray light beginning through the barn cracks. "You were thinking," he said. "I often think," she said. "About what this morning," she considered how to say it. "About how much it all depends on small decisions," she said. "The ones you make in the middle of the night when no one is watching and nothing is certain." He looked at her. "Like pulling a man out of a creek." "Like pulling a man out of a creek," she agreed. He took her free hand, the one that wasn't resting on Dolly's neck, and held it easy and warm, and they stood in the barn together in the early morning, the way they had sat on the fence that long ago afternoon and watched the sunset, the way they had talked by lantern light in the cold straw, the way they had in all the particular places where a life touches itself and recognizes its own shape. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Still." "Still," she said. "More than still, increasingly." He turned to face her then, and she looked up at him in the growing gray light, at the face she knew as well as her own now, at the eyes the color of weathered copper and the jaw that had needed a shave the night she found him and always needed one in the mornings. And she felt the same pull she had felt the first time she looked at him closely, not diminished by time but given depth by it, the way water looks deeper the clearer it gets. "Good," he said, "because I intend to keep at it." She laughed, and Dolly shifted at the sound of it, and the birds outside grew louder, and the light came on, and the day opened up in front of them, all its particular demands and beauties and the work that was also the good of it, and they turned together and went to meet it. The Carver farm was real. It stood and it held, and the people in it chose each other daily and without regret. And outside the barn door the Kansas spring was making its annual extraordinary argument for the value of continuing. And it was, as always, entirely convincing.